Cuba is a small Caribbean country, just 90 miles from Florida, but it is a global giant in the degree of solidarity it has given to many countries in Africa over the past 40 years. In today's program, we will explore the recent history of Cuban solidarity with Africa. I'm Bill Fletcher, your host. Thanks very much for joining us. From thousands of Cuban troops fighting alongside African freedom fighters in the struggle to liberate Angola and Guinea-Bissau in the 1970s, to fighting the Ebola virus in West Africa today, this small country of 12 million people, many of whom are the descendants of enslaved Africans, has both exemplified and defined what unselfish solidarity and support is all about. And because Cuba has been ruled since 1959 by a revolutionary socialist government led first by Fidel Castro and now by his brother Raul Castro, it has been the victim of a 53-year-old economic embargo imposed on it by the United States government. It has also suffered an attempted Washington-backed invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961 and a long string of CIA-orchestrated assassination attempts on Fidel Castro. In spite of Washington's ceaseless aggression against Cuba over the past 5 decades, the country has not only survived, but has grown into a global power in the areas of medicine and public health. According to the World Health Organization, Cuba is sending the largest foreign medical team from a single country to West Africa to help fight the Ebola virus. Cuba has helped establish medical schools in several African countries such as Ethiopia, Gambia, and Uganda. And Cuban health professionals have worked in African countries such as Angola, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Congo-Brazzaville. It was the Cuban doctors who organized the first vaccination campaign against polio in the Republic of Congo. Today, hundreds of young Africans are studying in Cuban universities to become doctors and nurses and healthcare providers. Today, we'll examine Cuba's role in the fight against Ebola, and we'll also talk about the hitherto hidden history of secret back-channel talks and negotiations between the U.S. and Cuban diplomats conducted over the past few decades. We're joined by Peter Kornblum, who is a co-author with William Leogrand of the much-acclaimed book, Back Channel to Cuba. He is also the director of the Cuba Documentation Project at the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C., and is the author of The Pinochet File, a declassified dossier on atrocity and accountability. Welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I've really been looking forward to this interview after hearing about your book, and there's several different things I want to get to. But the first thing was something that struck me, that you describe a moment in the mid-1970s where Henry Kissinger was proposing to then President Gerald Ford the possibility of an attack on Cuba. And I wondered if you could just simply set the stage and explain the context of that. And then I'd like to talk more about the other history that you've brought out.
I mean, the stage is essentially 18 months of Kissinger's secret diplomacy, top secret diplomacy, to reach out to Fidel Castro, offer kind of a peaceful coexistence if Castro kind of mitigated his kind of pro-revolutionary operations around the world, and a normalization of relations. And Kissinger initiated contact with Castro in the summer of 1974 through a handwritten message to the Cuban leader that was carried down to Cuba by emissaries. And it basically said, we have things to talk about. I prefer to do it discreetly through intermediaries. Let me know if you're willing. And that set in motion a whole series of secret meetings, 3-hour negotiating session in secret at the Pierre Hotel in New York City. As this process was going on, Kissinger received a direct request from Agustin Neto, head of the MPLA party in Angola, the party that was poised to lead Angola into the post-colonial stages of African history. And he was being attacked by CIA-supported rebels, also supported by South Africa, which decided that the MPLA was too radical to have as a government of Angola. So Kissinger had a whole strategy. He was going to covertly try and overthrow Neto. But Castro stepped in and sent 36,000 Cuban troops to Angola. And this infuriated Kissinger. Not only had he tried to reach out to Castro and offered an olive branch only to have his rubbed in his face, essentially. But Castro, the head of this little Caribbean island, was projecting military power in a faraway continent. And, in Kissinger's imperial mindset, only the United States had the right and the ability to do that. And so he became extremely angry in the fall of 1975 and early 1976. He began talking to the president of the United States, Gerald Ford, about smashing that pipsqueak and humiliating the Cubans and forcing them out of Africa by actually attacking them. We have to clobber the Cubans, he said to Gerald Ford in the Oval Office.
And the only thing that stopped this, I assume, was the 1976 election.
Well, that's right. Kissinger said to Gerald Ford, I think we're going to have to smash the Cubans, but we'll have to wait until after the 1976 elections. And President Ford said, I agree. And of course, we all know that Gerald Ford lost the 1976 presidential election to Jimmy Carter. Carter had a completely different perspective. But let me say this. During 1976, Kissinger convened a very high-level group of senior advisors, including then the Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense during the Ford administration as well as the Bush administration. And he ordered them to draw up contingency plans to attack Cuba if Cuba sent troops beyond Angola. We obtained for this book, Back Channel to Cuba, the hidden history of negotiations between Washington and Havana. We obtained for that book these secret contingency plans. We obtained the declassification of them and posted them on our website and gave them to the New York Times. So now the world knows about these plans, and they're quite fascinating. People haven't really read through them carefully, but they show that Kissinger was extremely concerned that Cuban troops would go beyond Angola and actually start marching towards South Africa, the hated apartheid regime, which the whole world had condemned. And Kissinger's real concern was that the United States, in order to block the Cubans and the Soviets behind them from taking kind of over all of Africa, and particularly South Africa, would have to openly support the apartheid regime, the white apartheid regime. And he didn't want basically to be seen as on that side of history, on the racist side of history. And so he was seeking a way to punish the Cubans before they could get that far, either through an attack on military bases in Cuba, a blockade, mining the harbors of Cuba, some type of use of military force. He never got the chance to do that, but it's now part of the historical record.
Let's go back then historically. The Cuban Revolution succeeds in 1959. Weren't there earlier efforts, particularly during the Kennedy years, to reach out to the Cuban revolutionary government?
Yeah, in this new book, we document the other side of Kennedy's policy towards Cuba. Everybody who's looked at Cuba, even for a second, knows that during John F. Kennedy's days, there was the Bay of Pigs invasion led by the CIA. There was the assassination plots against Fidel Castro, also by the CIA, exploding seashells and plots to poison his cigars and sniper rifles to assassinate him. There was the trade embargo that Kennedy actually imposed on Cuba. But secretly, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy got it into his head that the world might be safer if he arrived at some kind of détente, not only with the other superpower of the Soviet Union, but also with the Cuban Revolution. And through a series of intermediaries, 2 reporters and a New York lawyer, Kennedy began kind of low-level talks, what were known as a low-level dialogue between Cuba and the United States. He actually had an emissary talking to Castro about the possibility of a peaceful coexistence at the very moment that he was assassinated in Dallas. And that emissary shared this horrible news with Castro as they listened on the radio to the reports of Kennedy's assassination. Fidel Castro turned to this emissary, a French journalist named Jean Daniel, and he said, "There goes your mission of peace. There goes your mission of peace."
In looking at each of these moments, is there any pattern that you would identify in terms of why they did not succeed in establishing normal relations between the United States and Cuba?
There's a bunch of reasons. One is that the United States had a series of demands over the years as preconditions for kind of serious talks. They wanted Cuba to stop supporting leftist parties and leftist guerrillas in Latin America and elsewhere. And they wanted Cuba basically to sever its military and political relationship with the Soviet Union. Even as Cuba was in the dark shadow of the United States, only 90 miles off its coast, even as Cuba was facing fears of a renewed Bay of Pigs, exile, terrorism, constant attacks emanating from the shores of the United States was basically saying, if you want to have better relationships with us, you better get rid of the Soviet Union. Then after the Cold War ended, the United States came up with a new set of demands, which was basically you need to democratize and change your political system. You need to either change your foreign policy, get out of Africa, you need to change your political system, democratize. And Fidel Castro repeatedly said to U.S. emissaries, look, you seem to think there's two sets of rules in this world. One set of rules for you in which you can go around the world with your military and your CIA and do whatever you want. And another set of rules for countries like ours in which we're not supposed to do anything. We're not supposed to pursue our own foreign policy. We're not supposed to pursue our own interests and define our own economic and political systems. And that's what the revolution was for, he would point out to these emissaries. And we can't negotiate with you until you lift the embargo and stop threatening us. And then we're happy to negotiate. And this has gone back and forth for, over 50 years now. We finally arrived at a point right now with the Obama administration in its last 2 years in which perhaps both countries are now equally ready to see the benefits of bearing this dark political hatchet of all these decades and actually coming to a modus vivendi and normal relations.
Peter Kornbluh, author of Back Channel to Cuba, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you very much for joining this segment of The Global African. We'll be back in a moment. So we're here with Juan Jacomino, who is the second secretary of the Cuban Interest Section in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for joining us for The Global African.
My pleasure, Bill.
The response to the Ebola epidemic is like a stunning contrast. We have on the one hand Australia, which seems to have tried to seal itself off. On the other hand, we have Cuba, which has sent personnel. What explains the Cuban position?
I think you have to look at it in two ways, or two factors that have combined in my assessment of it, which is Cuba's accumulated medical expertise and Cuba's deep-rooted sense of solidarity and friendship with Africa, which dates back to many decades, many years. So these two factors had to unleash Cuba's response. I mean, there was no way that it could have been otherwise if you consider the history of Cuba's cooperation with Africa, especially in the medical field, because we've had doctors there for decades now. And actually in Sierra Leone and these countries affected by Ebola, there were Cuban medical brigades working. There were 32, can you imagine, 32 Cuban medical brigades in Africa at the moment of the outbreak. That was the kind of cooperation we had with Africa. More than 4,000 medical personnel, Cuban medical personnel in Africa. So this is all part of the history, really, Bill.
What's the Cuban government's analysis of the Ebola epidemic and how to respond to it? How does that differ from other countries?
Actually, the Cuban response was threefold, so to speak. Sending making use of the personnel there, sending doctors, new Cuban doctors specialized in the treatment of this disease, in dealing with diseases, and training the local resources so they could better deal with the effects of this. Actually, not only in countries affected, but in countries not yet affected, African countries not yet affected by the Ebola outbreak.
So what explains what I was referring to earlier about this contrast between Australia and Cuba?
We probably have to go back to what I said at the beginning, Cuba's sense of solidarity, Cuba's sense, probably sense of indebtedness, feeling indebted to Africa, which brought Cuba to assist Africa in other fields in the past, but of course in this case all the more so because of the nature of the disease. I would say that would have been considered Cuba's default reaction to a situation like that. You couldn't have expected otherwise from Cuba. It would have been on Cuba to react otherwise.
It was noteworthy that the New York Times mentioned very favorably the role of Cuba in responding to the Ebola epidemic. What do you make of that?
No, let me follow up on that, Bill, and say, yes, there was this article by the New York Times trying to make sense of the fact that Cuba, like some of the papers had been reporting, was punching probably beyond its weight here in the case of the Ebola, because Cuba was really coming out strong to fight the disease. But not only that, I remember there was recently a meeting in Havana on Ebola at the level of ALBA that has generated reaction in the continent. So countries in the area, and in the Caribbean itself, Jamaica and others, have been looking up to Cuba to see what they can do in case they might need assistance to this disease. And interestingly enough, as we speak today, there's a meeting that began in Havana, a technical meeting of ALBA, gathering representatives from ALBA, which is the Bolivarian alternative for the Americas, which is an integration mechanism spearheaded by Venezuela and Cuba. So there is concern, and there's always been on the part of Cuba the idea that awareness needs to be raised and all the resources necessary mobilized, all the expertise, etc., to counter this terrible epidemic.
In the United States, there's been a high degree of panic in connection with the Ebola epidemic. And I mean, we've had a situation where roughly 9 people have contracted the illness out of a country of more than 300 million people. It's actually become a political issue. How does that compare with the situation in Cuba? How are people responding there in Cuba to the epidemic?
It's probably hard to gauge from here, Bill, and I have to be very honest. You have to be in Havana, you have to be in Cuba to really gauge that. I can give you what I would say would be my Cuban perspective on that, which is that we are anything but selfish. We do not look at our own needs and our own things, but things that others might need. It's us. That's what we are like. So probably in the case of Ebola, I can probably tell you that the general reaction in Cuba is the same reaction that you got from the doctors, because, okay, there are more than 400 Cuban medical experts in Africa fighting Ebola, but there are 1,500 volunteers, and these doctors, by the way, are volunteers. So if you got 1,500 doctors ready to go to Africa to fight Ebola, in which effort, in an effort in which they could die, well, imagine Cubans in our homes. I'm sure that there's a lot of, first of all, recognition for what the Cuban medical personnel is doing, and number two, a great appreciation of the need to help and not to isolate. So if anything, we don't isolate.
In light of the fact that Cuba and the United States have both responded to the Ebola epidemic, sending personnel, equipment, etc., what do you think that this means, or potentially means, for the future of relations between Cuba and the United States? Is this an opening?
I think Fidel Castro himself said days ago that the Ebola thing should not be politicized. So this thing has to be dealt with as what it is, which is a terrible epidemic that needs to be controlled and needs to be left behind. But at the same time, Cuba has said that Cuba is ready to cooperate in this fight against this terrible disease with any nation, including the United States.
Back in 2005, at the time of Hurricane Katrina, both Cuba and Venezuela responded to the disaster, offering assistance to the United States. The Bush administration at the time rejected that offer of assistance. What motivated Cuba to respond as it did to this disaster?
Well, thank you for pointing that out, because actually this is connected to the Ebola, to Cuba's cooperation against Ebola, because the medical doctors that were sent by Cuba there are members of a contingent that was set up in 2005 when Katrina. Indeed, a medical contingent with experts on disaster medicine, what they call disaster medicine, and containment of infectious diseases. We had a long history of, number one, fighting against the effects of hurricanes that yearly hit us on different parts of the island. So we have to deal with these disasters constantly. And we had helped Central America, Latin America, the Caribbean with hurricane situations. So we had the expertise. And in the case of Katrina, which was, as we remember, a big disaster, well, Cuba offered cooperation. And this is when this brigade, this medical brigade, by the way, called Henry Reeves, was set up with more than 1,500 medical experts who made up that brigade, self-contained with everything they needed, ready to depart for New Orleans, and the U.S. decided that it wasn't necessary.
Cuba has developed a global reputation for the development and deployment of medical personnel around the world. What explains the importance that the revolution gave to the development and deployment of medical personnel?
Cuba has considered healthcare as a human right, as a given. So we don't charge you for that. If you get sick, you have to be provided with care and with the medications and the hospitals. So there was this effort on the part of Cuba to do away from the past and regain that capacity to treat its sick, its patients when they need it. So Cuba started training doctors, and in that same spirit of cooperation that has assisted Cuba in sports, because Cuba has assisted in sports with sports training in the world. Cuba started assisting other nations in the world to train its own doctors by sending teachers to their medical teachers to those nations, and by welcoming students in Cuba. So the medical profession in Cuba has been one that has been developed greatly after the revolution, and together with that development has come assisting other nations in that effort, because, like I said, we see this as a given, as a right of any individual to be treated when they're sick. And in that, along those lines, Cuba has developed its own medical forces and assisted others in the world too. But this is very much in a nutshell.
Thank you very much for taking this time. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, really.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. Thanks for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next time.